The invitation arrived on White House stationery, heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of formality that was meant to impress. Muhammad Ali held it in his hands, reading it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table without saying a word. His wife Lonnie watched him from the doorway. "You going?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just sat there, staring at the letter like it was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Don't know yet," he finally said. It was 1974. Ali had just regained his heavyweight title in Zaire, shocking the world by defeating George Foreman in what people were already calling the greatest upset in boxing history. The Rumble in the Jungle had made him a global icon again, erasing years of exile and controversy. Now the White House wanted him. President Gerald Ford, who'd only been in office a few months after Nixon's resignation, was hosting a ceremony honoring American athletes. Ali's name was on the list. But Ali remembered. He remembered 1967, when he'd refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War. He remembered the government stripping him of his title, his license, his livelihood. He remembered being called a traitor, a coward, a disgrace. He remembered 3.5 years of his prime gone because he'd stood on principle. And now they wanted to shake his hand. Lonnie sat down across from him. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. Ali looked up at her. "Thinking about whether a handshake erases what they did." "Does it?" "No." "Then why are you considering it?" He thought for a long moment. "Because maybe it's not about me anymore. Maybe it's about showing young people that you can stand up, take the punishment, and still be standing when they finally realize you were right." Lonnie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then go," she said, "but go as yourself, not as what they want you to be." Ali nodded slowly. 2 weeks later, he stood in the East Room of the White House. The room was full of athletes, politicians, photographers, and reporters. Cameras clicked constantly. Conversations hummed like static. Ali wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his bow tie slightly crooked in a way that seemed intentional. He moved through the room with his usual grace, shaking hands, posing for pictures, but his eyes were watchful. He learned long ago to read rooms the way he read opponents in the ring, and this room felt tense beneath its polished surface. President Ford stood near the center, surrounded by aides and advisors. He was smiling, working the crowd with practiced ease, but there was something stiff about it, something performative. When Ali approached, the room shifted. Conversations paused. People turned to watch. Ford extended his hand. "Champ," he said warmly, "good to have you here." Ali shook it, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Thank you, Mr. President." They stood there for a moment, cameras flashing, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Ford leaned in slightly, still smiling, his voice just loud enough for Ali and the few people nearest to hear. "You know, Ali, a lot of people were upset with you back then. The war, the draft, all that business. But I'm glad you came around. Shows maturity." The words landed like a jab. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. Ali's expression didn't change. He just looked at Ford with those calm, steady eyes. "Came around?" Ali repeated quietly. Ford's smile faltered slightly. "Well, you're here, aren't you? Water under the bridge." The room was still watching. People were close enough to sense something happening, but not close enough to hear exactly what. Ali took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, the kind of voice that made people lean in to listen. "Mr. President, with respect, I didn't come around. My position never changed. I didn't want to kill people I had no quarrel with. That was true then, it's true now." Ford's smile froze. Ali continued, his tone still calm, still respectful, but unyielding. "I came here today because you invited me, but don't mistake my presence for agreement with what was done to me. I lost 3.5 years of my career. I lost millions of dollars. I was called every name you can imagine, and I was right." The silence around them was becoming noticeable now. Conversations were stopping. People were turning. Ford's jaw tightened. His aides shifted uncomfortably. "I think you're misunderstanding," Ford began. "No, sir," Ali interrupted gently. "I understand perfectly. You want to shake my hand now because it's convenient, because I won again, because the war is over and people are asking questions. But where were you when they stripped my title? Where was this invitation when I couldn't fight, couldn't earn, couldn't do the only thing I trained my whole life to do?" Ford's face had gone from diplomatic smile to barely concealed irritation. "You have a lot of nerve coming into this house and lecturing me," he said stiffly. Ali didn't flinch. "You invited me," he said simply, "and I came, but I came as Muhammad Ali, not as whoever you wanted me to be." He took a small step back, his posture still respectful, still composed. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. President. I appreciate the recognition, but recognition doesn't erase history, and history will remember that I stood for something when it cost me everything. History will also remember who stood against me." Ford said nothing. His face was a mask now, professional and distant. Ali turned to leave, but then paused and looked back. "One more thing, sir." Ford waited. "I don't hate you. I don't hate anyone, but I also don't forget, and neither should the young people watching this. Stand for what you believe in, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you, because eventually the world catches up to the truth." He gave a small nod, a gesture of respect despite everything, and walked away. The room erupted. Not immediately, but as Ali moved toward the exit, conversations burst out like fire catching. Cameras scrambled to follow him. Aides rushed to Ford's side. Ali walked through it all with the same calm he'd entered with. Outside, the cool evening air hit his face. Lonnie was waiting by the car. "How'd it go?" she asked. Ali smiled for the first time since entering the building. "Honest." She studied his face, then nodded. "Good." They drove in silence for a while. Finally, Ali spoke. "I didn't go there to make a scene. I know. But I couldn't pretend either. I know that too." He looked out the window at the city passing by. "You think I was wrong?" Lonnie thought about it. "I think you were you, and that's all you've ever been." Ali nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's all I got." The next morning, the headlines were brutal. Ali disrespect president at White House. Boxer lectures Ford in embarrassing scene. Ali's inappropriate outburst. But beneath those headlines, other stories were forming. On college campuses, students talked about it with something like awe. In barbershops and living rooms across Black America, people nodded and said, "That's Ali." In countries around the world where people had watched him fight and listened to him speak, the story spread with a different interpretation. Muhammad Ali had walked into the most powerful building in America and refused to bow. Not with violence, not with disrespect, but with truth. A week later, Ali received a letter. It was from a young man in Detroit, 18 years old, about to be drafted. "Dear Mr. Ali, I saw what you did at the White House. I've been scared about going to war, scared about standing up, scared about what people will think. But you showed me that standing up is worth it, even if it costs everything. Thank you for being brave when it mattered most." Ali read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer with dozens of others just like it. That, he thought, was why it mattered. Not the headlines, not the controversy, but the kid in Detroit who now knew he didn't have to compromise himself to survive. Years later, in 1996, Ali stood in Atlanta's Olympic Stadium. His hands shook from Parkinson's disease. His movements were slow and uncertain. But when he raised the Olympic torch to light the flame, the entire world watched. And President Clinton, who was there that night, approached him afterwards. That moment at the White House in '74 with Ford, I was a young law professor then, and I remember you thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. Ali looked at him with those same steady eyes. "Just couldn't lie," he said simply, his voice weakened by illness, but his meaning clear. Clinton nodded. "I know. That's why it mattered." They shook hands. No cameras this time, no crowd, just 2 men, one of whom had learned something from the other 22 years earlier. By 2016, when Ali passed away,
The story had become a legend. People told it different ways. Some exaggerated it, some simplified it, but the core remained the same. Muhammad Ali had walked into the White House, been insulted to his face, and responded not with anger, but with dignity and truth. At his funeral, President Obama spoke. Ali stood with King and Mandela, but he also stood alone when standing alone cost him everything. That's courage, real courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right despite the consequences. In the pews, Ali's children listened. His daughter, Lila, thought about a conversation she'd once had with her father about that day in 1974. Did you know what would happen? Did you know it would become such a big deal? Ali smiled. Baby girl, I just knew I couldn't let him think I'd forgotten. Too many people were watching.
Young people. People who needed to know you don't have to sell yourself to survive. You can stand up and still be standing when it's over. Were you scared? She'd asked. He'd thought about that. Not scared, he'd said finally, just clear. When you're clear about who you are, fear doesn't have much room. Now, sitting at his funeral, Lila understood what he'd meant. Her father hadn't been perfect. He'd made mistakes. He'd hurt people. He'd been human in all the complicated ways humans are. But in that moment at the White House, he'd shown something essential. That dignity isn't given, it's claimed. That respect isn't about being liked, it's about being true. That history remembers not the comfortable moments, but the brave ones. The ceremony ended. People filed out slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving meant accepting he was really gone. But in a way, he wasn't, because the story lived on. The young man in Detroit who'd been inspired by Ali's stand at the White House, he'd become a civil rights lawyer. He'd taught his children to stand up for what they believed in. They'd taught their children the same. The reporters who'd written those harsh headlines in 1974, some of them had later admitted they'd been wrong, that Ali had been braver than they'd understood at the time. The politicians who'd condemned him, most were forgotten now, their names footnotes in history books. But Muhammad Ali, he was eternal. Not because he won fights, but because he fought for something bigger than himself. And on that day in 1974, when a president had tried to rewrite history with a handshake and a smile, Ali had refused. Not with hatred, not with violence, but with something more powerful, the truth. Simple, clear, uncompromising. The kind of truth that doesn't fade with time. The kind that gets passed down through generations. The kind that changes people. And in that East Room, surrounded by power and privilege and people who wanted him to forget, Muhammad Ali had done what he'd done his entire life. He'd stood up. Not because it was easy, not because it was popular, but because it was right. And in doing so, he'd shown the world what courage actually looks like. Not in the ring, but in the moment when everything tells you to stay quiet, to smile, to play along, and you don't. You speak, calmly, clearly, truthfully. That was Ali's real knockout punch, not delivered with his fists, but with his presence, his refusal to be anything other than himself. And decades later, long after both he and Ford were gone, people still told the story. In classrooms and courtrooms and living rooms, to children who needed to know that standing up was possible, to adults who'd forgotten, to anyone who'd ever been told to compromise themselves for comfort. The story spread not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And real courage, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that actually changes things, that's the courage that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to pretend otherwise. Not even for a president, not even in the White House, not ever. That was Muhammad Ali.
Not the fighter who danced and jabbed and talked endless trash, but the man who walked into power's house and said, "I haven't changed. I was right then, I'm right now, and nothing you do will make me forget what you did." And then walked out, head high, conscience clear, legacy secured. That moment didn't make him great. He was already great, but it showed the world what greatness actually means. Not perfection, but integrity. Not winning every time, but never losing yourself. And that lesson, delivered in a room full of power by a man who'd lost everything and gained it back without compromising, that lesson echoes still. In every person who chooses truth over comfort, in every moment someone stands alone and stays standing, in every young person who learns that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the presence of conviction. Muhammad Ali taught that lesson many times, in the ring, in exile, in comeback, but never more clearly than that day in 1974, when a president had tried to rewrite history with a handshake and a smile. Ali had refused, not with hatred, not with violence, but with something more powerful, the truth. Simple, clear, uncompromising, the kind of truth that doesn't fade with time, the kind that gets passed down through generations, the kind that changes people. And some men like Ali, won't let you rewrite their story, no matter who asks, no matter where, no matter what it costs. That's not stubbornness, that's integrity. And integrity, once claimed, becomes unshakable. Not because it's easy, but because it's who you are. And who you are matters more than anything else, even in the White House, especially there. Muhammad Ali knew that. He lived it. And in living it, he showed the rest of us how. Not with a lecture, not with a sermon, but with a moment. One conversation, one refusal to pretend, one man standing in a room full of power and saying, "This is who I am, this is what I believe, and you cannot make me forget." That was the response that made history, not because it was loud, but because it was true. And truth spoken clearly in the face of power, that changes everything. Always has, always will. That's Ali's legacy. Not the record, not the titles, not the fame, but the courage to be himself when everyone wanted him to be someone else. The courage to remember when everyone wanted him to forget. The courage to stand when sitting would have been easier. That courage lives on. In every person who refuses to compromise, in every moment someone chooses integrity over comfort, in every stand taken despite the cost. Muhammad Ali didn't just fight in rings, he fought for something bigger. And on that day in 1974, surrounded by people who wanted to erase his sacrifice with a ceremonial invitation, he won. Not with his fists, but with his truth. And that victory, that quiet, dignified, uncompromising victory, will outlast every other fight he ever fought, because it showed us who he really was. Not the greatest in the ring, but the greatest in the ways that actually matter. In conscience, in courage, in the refusal to be anything less than himself. Even when the President of the United States tried to rewrite his story, Ali wouldn't let him, and the world has never forgotten.
I make no money from these videos. My sole purpose is to keep Muhammad Ali and his incredible legacy alive. Muhammad Ali wasn't just a world champion boxer. He was a philosophy, a stand for justice, and a global symbol of honor and courage. His life story, his struggles against the tide, and his unwavering principles deserve to be passed on to future generations. That is why on this channel I will continue to share iconic moments from his life, untold stories, and the deep wisdom of the greatest. Every video is a sincere tribute to his memory.
If you also believe that Muhammad Ali is a legend who should never be forgotten, and if you want his teachings to reach more people, please subscribe. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to continue this mission. Thank you. Let's keep the spirit of Muhammad Ali alive together.